So why is it important to assess our students? Well, in the area of writing, it's important for us to know how our students are doing so that we can know what steps we need to take next. When we assess our students, it shows us when learning is taking place and when it is not taking place. It also helps us to know if our classroom instruction and our activities are appropriate for the students and how they're responding to them. It allows us to know whether or not we're providing them with activities that are too difficult or ones that are not difficult enough. And assessment allows us to see which students could benefit from help or which ones might need a further challenge. Assessing is also an opportunity for us to provide children with opportunities to take ownership of their own learning. We want them to begin to learn how to assess their own work so that they can begin to do that independently. Assessment allows us to also show others how our students are performing. We can use this information and share it with our school personnel or administration, with parents in the community, to show that we as teachers are doing an effective job, as well as to show the community how our students are doing. This is the teaching learning cycle taken from Richard C. Owens Corporation. You'll see here the arrows that go in a cyclical manner. One of the questions I have for you is, where do you think we begin on this cycle? Does it begin with the assessment, the evaluation, planning, teaching, or learning? Take a minute and answer that question before I move on. When we look at the learning cycle, many teachers will begin at the planning stage. They will begin to look at the curriculum that they have mapped out for them and plan their lessons based on the curriculum. When teachers do this, they are missing a key element to the teaching learning cycle. We really should begin at the assessment stage. It's important for us first to know what our students can do before we begin planning instruction. Otherwise, we may plan things that are not appropriate, things that may be too challenging, or things that our students already know. So we want to begin the teaching learning cycle at the assessment stage, where we collect information about students' progress. The next step is evaluation. We want to figure out, based on the assessment that we've given, what our students are able to do, or what they are attempting to do, and then determine what they need to do next. That moves us into the planning stage, where we will select our objective, we'll determine how we're going to group students, determine what resources we're going to use, and what approach we're going to utilize in teaching this skill. Then comes the teaching phase. This is where we will use the zone of proximal development or scaffolding to give the students the appropriate support that they need. And then hopefully the next stage is the learning stage, when students will take what we have taught them and begin to process it and make it their own. From there, we go back to assessing to determine whether or not they have learned, whether or not they have learned what it is that we want them to know. There are several principles of assessment. The first is that assessment is a reciprocal and synergistic relationship between assessment and teaching. And I love this concept because it's so important for us to remember that reciprocal, meaning that it goes back and forth, that teaching and assessment really do work together, and that it's synergistic, which means that when the two work together, we get the greatest benefit. It's important to remember that we cannot just assess and we cannot just teach, that we need both of those elements, that it's a relationship that really strengthens each other to provide the best learning possible for our students. The next principle is that assessment on a daily basis through observation is the core of assessment. We really gain the most understanding of what our students are able to do by observing them in a regular classroom setting on a daily basis. The third principle is that children should be actively engaged in the writing or the assessment process. Again, I mentioned this in the previous slide. It's a wonderful opportunity for students to grow and to gain the skills necessary to assess their own work. Because when we think about ourselves as writers, and in anything that we do, we really are constantly kind of assessing our progress as we do it. So teaching children to use this skill and to see how they're improving and what they need to do to be better, and reflecting on their work on a regular basis is going to be a key piece to helping them advance. And finally, assessment should take many different forms. We want to utilize as many strategies as we can to assess students so that we can get a well-rounded picture of what they are able to do. Here are some guiding questions that we can use as we assess our students' work and begin to plan for the next steps. What do I want my students to know and be able to do? How do we know that my students are learning? And how will I respond when they do not learn? Or how will I extend and enrich for those that need it? Let's look at the two different forms of assessment. The first is formative. This takes place during instruction, and it's an ongoing process. It's usually informal, and it informs and guides the teacher as they make instructional decisions. Formative assessments can even drive your directions and your decisions as you are teaching. So, for example, if you do a quick check with your whole class, you ask them a question and everybody gives some kind of choral response, or they give an immediate response to you by maybe showing a thumbs up or something like that. Then you can do a quick check for who has understood this concept. If you see that several students are not successfully able to answer your question, then you right then decide to revisit that concept before you move on to the next thing. So a formative assessment is a really valuable tool that teachers use on a regular basis when they're teaching lessons for writing and all subject areas. The other type of assessment that we'll talk about is summative assessment, and this is more evaluative, and it often results in a grade or a ranking, and most typically will come at the conclusion of learning. So when you finish maybe your lesson, you will then take a summative assessment to see how the students did overall with that lesson, or it may come at the end of a unit. There are different forms of assessment that we use when thinking about writing instruction and writing development. The first is large scale. This is often determined by the district or even the state. Students typically are given some kind of prompt and they're given a time limit. This can vary from state to state, or as I said, school systems or districts may determine these types of assessments. And in Tennessee, we currently are using one where students are given some excerpts that they have to read and then are given a prompt, and they have to respond to that prompt. For example, in third grade, students are given 2 writing pieces and they have to kind of give an overview of what they've read, and then they also have to read 2 pieces and compare and contrast. And again, they're given a time limit. They're often not given access to resources. This is a time when students basically just have to utilize what's given in the directions, which is typically just paper pencil, or even this year in Tennessee, we're moving to actually online testing. So the students would be given a computer or some kind of technology to complete the assessment. The paper with the prompts and a pencil, and that's about it. Students don't have access to the reading or the writing resources that they're used to using in the classroom. This is also often done so that we are only able to maybe get a first draft done or maybe a little bit of revision. We don't go through the entire writing process when we're completing this kind of assessment. The papers or the result is often sent away and scored by other individuals, and you don't typically, from my experience, you never get that result. You never get the actual product back. So I was never able to see what it was my students actually wrote. All I received back was a score and maybe some notes on generally what my students had done, and their maybe a rubric or something like that were given back. This is a good tool to use to be able to assess across the board students' development, but on a daily basis, this doesn't really help me as a teacher to drive my instruction. That's why classroom assessment is a great tool that we can use to help our writers develop. This looks at performance over time and considers a variety of genres. And it's not just one single piece, but it looks at my writer as an overall ability. It focuses on the process rather than the product. We're looking, to see how they're doing in all stages of the writing process. And it's based on my observations and my perceptions of my students. Since I know and I work with the students on a regular basis, I have to be careful to make sure that this insight that I have does not lead to bias. So, for example, if I had a student that came to me at the beginning of the year that was way below grade level, maybe the student wasn't even able to recognize his name yet, but now midway through the year, they are able to, put the beginning sound of each word that they're trying to write. And I see that they have made incredible progress from where they began. So a lot of times it's easy for me to celebrate that success and think that the student is really performing and doing well, because based on where they came from, they are doing very well. What I have to be careful of is not to become complacent with that, but to remember that my student really was behind when they came. And even though they've made great progress, they still are behind where they should be. So I have to keep that in mind, making sure that I continue to try to close that gap so that they can come up to the standards that are required of them. There are several different assessments that we can use to look at student writing. Checklists, anecdotal records, running records can often give us information about students' writing as they read a piece or a passage and then they have to respond to it. That can give us information about students' writing as well. Rating scales, rubrics, those are all great tools. And the last one here, portfolios, is really a great one to show growth over time, allowing you to capture some pieces throughout the year to include in a portfolio can show students' growth from over a long period of time, whereas these other tools that we have help us more on a regular basis, maybe with more skills or specific things that we're assessing in their writing. Let's take a look now at the work done by David Madison in assessing young writers. He's developed what he's called an early learning continuum. And in this book, we learn how to assess students, young students, in their writing development. And he emphasizes that at this stage, pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, maybe some first grade students, that we're looking at oral language and attention to picture detail to really help develop young children's literacy. Let's look a little more closely at some of his elements to his continuum. You see here in the continuum that he's developed, on the left-hand side, the level of students' work. This is where we look at students' attention to detail in their picture, because most children at this age are going to be using mainly picture to do their form of writing. Some may begin to include elements of actual words or letters, sound associations, as they progress down to the level 5, but most of the work is going to be seen in the student's picture and the amount of detail that they're including in their picture. Then on the right-hand side, you're assessing students' oral language, their ability to tell you the story or tell you about the picture that they've done. Here in the middle box, we see that this is where we can include our objectives for after we assess the students in their student work and their oral language. Then we can use this middle section to guide instruction. And this is left blank on the previous slide because Madison and Freeman allow you an opportunity to make this conducive to your classroom. So it could be based on your state standards or maybe district expectations is how you might fill out this middle part. So the assessment is actually given, he recommends giving it 4 or maybe monthly, 4 times a year or maybe monthly. But here are the directions for how you would go about to give the assessment. The first step is going to be to ask the students to draw a picture with materials that they're familiar with. So you wouldn't necessarily have to be drawing. They might paint or they might construct out of clay. The one thing that you do want to make sure is that you use something they're used to so that that novel element is removed. And this is something that students feel comfortable with. In step 2, you are to ask the child about their work, but making sure that you don't prompt them by saying, well, where is mommy in your picture? Or what about your hair? You left off your hair. Because you want them to tell you about the picture just based on their own ability and not by giving any prompts from you. So you ask the child to tell you about their picture, and you write down the student's response. Then in the 5th step, you read back what the student has told you, and then ask them if there's anything that they would like to add to their picture. If the student wishes to add something, then they may, and you may record a little bit more based on what they tell you that they've added. Make sure that you never push the student to add to their story or to their picture, that this is simply an opportunity for them, but it is not a requirement. Then let's take a look at how to go about scoring when you have a finished piece. It's important that we are objective and that we do this based on the student's abilities and not as a reflection on our teaching abilities. We only want to focus on the student's work and what they're able to do so that we can help them to develop and progress over time. Sometimes it might be difficult to choose between one score and the next, and when this happens, it's recommended to always choose the lower number so that we can make sure that we have a good, solid understanding before we move on. One of the things that I often do is use the examples in the book, or as we begin to look at the writing benchmark series, you'll see that there are 9-week anchor papers, examples of good, solid, quality work for each stage in development. And this was always a really helpful tool for me when I was trying to determine what score to give a child. When I could see examples of what a strong level 2 student could do, then it allowed me to better understand where to score my students. If a child draws a shape that is recognizable, but you are unable to figure it out without having some sort of explanation, then the score is a 1. So if it's scribbles on the page or something, you see shapes there, but you can't determine what it is without them helping you, then that's the score that they would receive. And I love the step number 4. It's helpful to confer with a colleague, especially one who has knowledge of the student. A lot of times through our discussions, we're able to have a better understanding of what our student is attempting to do or what they are able to do when we have that opportunity to collaborate with another colleague. When assessing oral language, it's important that we assess students in English. Here it gives us some steps if your student is a non-English speaking student or second language learner, English language learner, then here are some opportunities for you to help support them. I'm not going to read through them, but just know that this information is here so that you would know what to do if you had a student that was an English language learner. So a student at a level 1, and if you have your book beside you right now, it would be really helpful to be able to see these pictures. This student often just scribbles. It's random things on the page. They're really just kind of exploring the materials, and the drawing is not recognizable. For a level 2 student, the work is recognizable, but only when the student talks about it. For a level 3, the student's work is recognizable, but lacks important detail that is critical to the story. A level 4 student's work contains important detail, but lacks writing. And remember, writing is in quote here because that could just be mock letters. But if the child is attempting to put some form of writing in their piece, then that would put them at the level 5, even if it's not actual writing. Now let's look at students' oral language. A level 1 student may not converse about his or her work. They might just gesture. This could be due to the fact that maybe they are an English language learner, or they might have a language development delay or a cognitive delay. A level 2 student may just give one-word labels or short phrases, maybe a simple sentence about what they've done. But often this is with some teacher questioning. The child may seem unsure and even give different responses to the teacher during continued conversation. So their description of their picture may change over time because they're not quite sure what they've drawn. A level 3 student gives one word or short phrases or simple sentences about what they've completed. The language remains constant during the conversation and over time. So with this example, when the teacher is talking to the student about what they've done, then the story does remain the same. And even if you come back to it several days later, you're going to get the same story. A level 4 student is able to tell the story about his or her own work with the teacher questioning and asking them questions about it. So let's talk about how to choose appropriate teaching objectives. Now that we have scored students based on student work and oral language, we want to begin to look at them based on where they fall. If we have a student that's in a level 1, level 2, or maybe even a level 3, we're going to be focusing on that top box. This is the middle column of the continuum. And here we're going to be looking at how we can help students develop detail in their work. Maybe adding some extra pieces to the construction that they've made or the drawing that they've done. In this section, the teacher may label objects within the picture. They're not going to dictate an entire story, though, for the child. The focus here is on, again, adding detail to their picture. Because the interaction between the teacher and the child is going to be done orally without any dictation, it's going to be important for the teacher to take some anecdotal notes so that you can record what has taken place in the interaction. In the next stage, you're looking at supporting students in level 3 and 4, maybe even sometimes 5, teaching them to add the detail to their work, but also to begin to extend their story, the oral language element. The teacher will begin dictating in this stage. So as the student tells the story, you're going to be dictating what the student is saying. And what we hope to teach children in this stage is that writing can be written down and remains constant over time. So when they come back, that their story is going to be retold the same way. And you will know this based on the dictation that you've taken. In the last stage, you're going to be focusing on students incorporating writing into their work. This is students that are in level 4 and 5, and it's going to begin with encouraging the students to label within their picture. Eventually, they'll begin to write their story below the picture. Now remember that the writing may just be controlled scribbling or mock letters, a random string of words or letters, and semi-phonetic attempts at spelling. This is typically a student in level 5, and the teacher is going to be moving from that role of dictation to having the students take more ownership in recording their message. So students during this stage are going to be developing their ability to tell the story orally, but also to begin to include it in their writing. And again, continue to add the detail into their picture. You want their picture to match the writing that they're composing. So at this point, what we're going to do is take a look at one of the assessments that I've done with my son Micah. I completed the Early Learning Continuum assessment on him. He had just turned 4 the week before we did this assessment. And what we are going to do is on D2L, I have posted a video of him, and I'm conducting the original assessment with him. And so you get to see him draw the picture and his thinking and conversation that we have while he's drawing the picture. And then I have another video that I've taken a week or so later when we came back, and I had Micah retell me the story of the picture that he had drawn, for you to be able to see if he was able to hold that constant story over time. After you've watched both of those videos, we're going to enter into a discussion on D2L where you tell me what score you would rate Micah in the areas of student work and oral language. I would also like for you to tell me specifically why you scored him those 2 scores, and what next steps you might have for Micah as a writer. We will do this together through the discussion board and come up with a final analysis or assessment for what we would do with Micah and what we would score him.